Hey everyone, I'm Andres from Connect's certified Zapier agency. Today I'm sharing a conversation with one of our senior consultants about building and optimizing Zapier connectors. If you're a SaaS company looking to integrate with Zapier, this video has some great insights, specifically on common challenges when building Zapier integrations, the difference between using the CLI and the UI, best practices for handling webhooks and triggers, and finally, real solutions from complex API scenarios. What makes this conversation unique is that it comes from our actual experience helping companies build successful Zapier integrations. Whether you're just starting to think about Zapier or looking to improve your existing integration, you'll find some valuable takeaways here. By the way, if you're looking to build or upgrade your Zapier connector, we can help. We've helped dozens of SaaS companies successfully launch on the Zapier platform, and we'd love to help you too. Look for the link in the description below to book a discovery call with us. Now, let's join the conversation.
It's because they've made some changes to their API. So they wanted to have the app updated on Zapier to follow their new API. So had to recreate some of the actions. So send SMS, and a couple of triggers. I think it was five in total. I think it was 2 actions and maybe 3 triggers, I think, or maybe 4 actions and 1 trigger, some combination of that. But so that's what we were doing for the latest project.
So I think there are 2 interesting points here. Is the first one, they tried to build a connector themselves.
Yeah.
What happened there? Do you remember what they're struggling with?
I think initially it was just designing the app on Zapier. So there it's a REST API. The way it was designed, I think maybe because they weren't familiar with the way you build apps on Zapier and how you would achieve some things. Because it's a CLI app, first and foremost, it wasn't a UI app, so you had to use the CLI action to build the app on Zapier. So I think because they had difficulty translating their REST API to Zapier, because although it's a REST API, it wasn't the typical setup. So some of the things for example, like hydration of the files. That's what they call it when you have to download a file on Zapier and the integration. So the technique to hydrate the file, it's a little. If you don't know it, then it can be a little bit complicated. And then even with the new API, creating separate triggers for new SMS and new MMS. If you don't know how to do it, because I did it, because it's the same, it is in the API, it's the same action. So when you get a new SMS and when you get a new MMS, it's literally the same endpoint that you're using. So you create a webhook and it's the same endpoint. But the difference is if it's an MMS, there's an attachment within it. So what I did was I created 2 separate triggers and just look for if the payload has an attachment in it. So one is an MMS, one is an SMS. Now, if you don't know that other technique, how to split and specifically configure a trigger on Zapier to show a particular case, then you might not be able to do it. So I think when it got to us, going back to the original question, I think it's because translating the API to the techniques on Zapier, they weren't familiar with.
So there are 2 things here. One, can you briefly tell me what's the difference between CLI and UI building?
So, well, with the UI, it's on Zapier. You can so you build the apps using predetermined buttons. So, for example, if you're creating an OAuth 2 app, connection app, you select OAuth as the authentication method, and it gives you specified field that you paste the typical content. CLI, you have to use a development environment, for example, like Visual Studio Code or whatever developer environment that you have. And you basically log into Zapier via command line, and all of the commands, you develop it using commands. So it's all in a dev environment. It's essentially the same, because even on the UI version, you are able to switch to code mode and write code. But the difference why you would go one or the other is a couple of reasons. So number one, you would use the UI if the API you're integrating is standard. So the OAuth connection style is standard. There isn't any sort of custom actions or custom steps you have to take. So they follow the standard exactly. So you don't have to do any customized actions like, probably encrypt the file, decrypt the file, that sort of thing. Because some APIs already have OAuth 2 authentication. Sometimes you have to do an additional step. For example, Bullhorn. You have to use Bullhorn or even ADP. In ADP, you have to use the certificates and the private key. With Bullhorn, you have to get a REST token additionally as well as the OAuth token to connect. So you won't be able to use, the UI version of the Zap builder for that because it doesn't follow the standard. Also, if you want to integrate, if you use a CLI, you are able to integrate custom libraries in your app because it's running on a Node environment. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Node package manager. You can download libraries of little tools that can do certain things. For example, let's say or even if you wanted to integrate Airtable directly in your app without using an Airtable step, you can add the Airtable SDK within your Zapier app. So you can add, and as long as there's a Node package module that you can download and add to your app, you can enhance the functionality. So you can, there's pretty much anything. There's, for example, there's stuff that could convert JSON files to PDF. There's, different libraries so you can extend and get more creative with your app in the CLI because you can download a Node package module and do whatever it allows you to do within the code right there. You're not able to do that in the UI because what you build on your developer environment, you upload that entire package to Zapier's environment. So all of the third-party libraries you integrate, those get packaged with your app as well. So if you recall, I think Grindery, where we did that app as well, they have a custom library that they had, which we use for authentication within the app. So we had to do a kind of a hybrid authentication using their custom library and the mechanisms that Zapier requests to you to have. So with CLI, you have a little bit more creativity and you can do pretty much anything within there. So theoretically, so you see there's an SDK for Airtable. Let's say there was an SDK for Notion and there's an SDK for Software. You could theoretically install all those libraries and in a single action, touch all of those separate apps and return the result within a single action. So you have a lot more that you can do within a CLI app than on a UI app. UI is once it's standard API, standard actions, you can use that and go on.
Awesome. So when working, first, there is this that you mentioned, there is a single endpoint, but they wanted to create multiple triggers.
Yeah, multiple triggers, yeah.
This is a common scenario and situation for many apps many software companies that want to build a Zapier connector. And I hear this question often. So what one tell me more about that. Have you seen what are the best practices or what are smart workarounds that you found?
Right. So that was one. Looking at the structure of the payload and knowing that they wanted 2 triggers. And again, essentially, the payload was identical when you receive an MMS message and you receive an SMS message. The only difference was, so even though SMS doesn't have an attachment, it does have the attachment property. It would always literally be empty if it's an SMS. Whenever it's an MMS, then it's gonna have an object within, because it's an array object, so the array would be empty. So I literally just say, okay, when the payload comes. So actually, what I did was I created these separate triggers, but I coded each one. So the SMS was coded to trigger and basically ignore the attachment property and look for the attachment property on the MMS. Because again, the way you create the webhook for MMS and MMS is the same. But when it's triggered, the MMS definitely needs to hydrate the file when it comes in. So so to the user, they'll see, oh, create a new SMS trigger or create a new MMS trigger. But behind the scenes for MMS, I'm actually trying to download the files that come in the attachment on MMS. On SMS, I ignore that property because it wouldn't exist. It would be empty.
What
So,
are the other, because these companies do this because it's easier for users to understand SMS, MMS, or there may be, like, I was working with a client today. They were using Logify, which is an Airbnb connector, and it sounds like the webhook works the same, but the like for bookings, for questions, so they have the same the order of a booking could have several stages, and they were triggering off using the same webhook. But when looking at the Zapier connector, they have different triggers of booked, requested, pending, stuff like that.
Yeah. So, well, for something like that, what you do is to the user, you'd present possibly different options to create different types of triggers. But then in the if it's the same webhook that you're using in the actual perform, so there's a function that you need to have that actually does the action in the trigger. It's the perform function. So within the perform function, what you would do is when you get that payload, you examine and you look for that specific, maybe it's a status property. So as long as the status is what it should be, then you return the data. If it isn't, you return empty. In Zapier apps, if you return empty, it doesn't trigger. But whenever you return data, it would trigger. So for that, if it's the same webhook, you just look at the actual data so theoretically it does trigger, but the Zap doesn't trigger unless you return data within it. So when Zapier receives the content, you examine the payload and see, oh, the status is correct, then you return, and then the Zap will trigger. If you return empty, nothing happens. So that's the thing. And I just remember something with the text box. When on their API, it doesn't. So when you create a webhook, and it's a combination of things. So with Zapier, there's a subscribe and unsubscribe function for webhooks. Subscribe is when you create the webhook. So on the API, they'll have to have a create function, and hopefully they have a delete function for the webhook. So you program the subscribe function to their creation webhook call on the API, and you pair that with the unsubscribe, which is a delete webhook. On Zapier, to delete the webhook, you need to provide an ID to delete. So what I ended their mechanism doesn't. I think they didn't have a way to
provide.
Oh, sorry. So yeah, provide an ID. So what I was doing, I was creating a unique identifier within the name of it, I think, and I would send that in the create function. And with the delete, I think I was extracting it from the UI from the URL of the subscribe function to be able to delete it. There was something missing in the API, so I had to do a workaround where I created and I extract the content. But I would have to look back at that specifically to see what that was. But I remember there was a portion where the API didn't have let's see, triggers and SMS.
No problem, but I love how you go through these workarounds, because APIs, documentations, and APIs in general are built by humans, and every API is different. So okay, I'm just curious. I'm not a technical guy, so I'm just curious if you can make the other way happen. So you have two endpoints, but you want to show up as only one trigger in Zapier. Is that doable?
Yeah. Sorry, you have two endpoints and you want it to show up as one trigger?
Yeah. Imagine that you have two endpoints or two webhooks for... by the way, does this work with webhooks and API polling as well?
Yeah. So there's polling style. Yeah, same process, yeah. You just don't have the subscribe and the unsubscribe with polling triggers. With polling triggers, what you do, you add the endpoint that you poll for content. What's important is there needs to be there needs to be a field that would change on the content. And we had a couple projects where we had to work around. That's what we were using Firebase for. Because with polling triggers, what it does, it calls that endpoint periodically. It depends on your account with Zapier. So if you have a pro account, it calls that endpoint every minute. The same triggering threshold that you have on your account is the same threshold for the polling. So it will keep polling for content. The first time you turn on the Zap, what it does, it makes the call and it catalogs that content. And then when it polls again, it would compare that content to the last time. If there's any difference, then it would trigger. That's how the polling trigger works. Some APIs don't have a modified property in the content. So let's say you're polling for properties on a real estate site. If it doesn't have the modified field, if the content is always the same, it will never trigger, even though there's a change of the content, but there's no property that says modified where the date when it was modified is changed. This app would never trigger. So what we usually do to work around is sometimes you could do a combination of the ID plus that's if they have the modified field. If they have the modified field, you return the ID plus the modified field so Zapier knows it would trigger. But if it doesn't have the modified field, you have to introduce that in some way. So what we worked around with sometimes was Firebase, where instead of polling directly the API, we had to do that for adaptive sports. What we did, we programmed the node environment on Firebase to poll for the content. And the way Firebase works is, if you send the same payload over, it would only trigger modified content if any bit of the content is different. So if anything is different, then it will trigger. So when it modifies and it's triggered, we then send that back to Zapier. But with polling, it needs to have a field to have modified. If it doesn't, then you have to work around it. But going back to your original question, if was it 2 endpoints and you wanted to have
well,
a
no, this was
trigger?
one question. And by the way, the last example was about league apps, was the app that you were mentioning. It was 2 questions. One, if webhooks and API calls, they do behave the same, where when you or similarly when you map them on Zapier and you create the trigger connectors. And the second question is, if just a curiosity, if you can have 2 webhooks or 2 endpoints, but on Zapier they show up in the same trigger as one trigger. Say this text time.
You possibly could, but you may have to use some third-party workarounds, because what happens with instant triggers, you get a unique URL for that trigger. If you create you create a single trigger on the app, but every instance of that trigger on that app gets a unique URL. So if you create a new Zap you create a separate trigger action, or you create a separate Zap with the same trigger, it is going to get a unique URL, which is going to be different than the original one. So theoretically, you can make it work where a single account on Zapier, you probably speak to a separate environment, which then talks to the API and then sends back the content to that Zap. You can do that theoretically. You definitely could, instead of going directly to the API. So let's say it's Teacup API you're integrating and it has multiple endpoints. You want to use the same webhook for everything. You would have to have a separate node environment that you speak to that speaks to Teacup and then sends it back. We kind of do something similar with league apps where we do that. But you can do it, but you have to use some third party, because when you create a new instance of the Zapier is going to give you a new unique URL. So the need for the third party one would be, every time you create an instance of this trigger, you just identify you have some separate database where you pair everything to that account. So you could do that, but you have to have a separate app that sits between the endpoint and that.
Yeah, this is not a common request.
Common, yeah.
But just
even there was a project where it wasn't an API, but we're using Webhook. But we were using the same webhook for every trigger on Trello, I think. So you register the same webhook when you create a webhook on Trello, you use the same webhook URL, um, on Trello. So every separate action that takes place on Trello, it goes to the same Zap. So when there's a card content, whether there's an update, whether there's whatever happens on the board on Trello, everything goes to the same webhook. The only reason why we could do that is because we're using the regular webhook action in Zapier, and the action to register. You have the chance to create your own webhook URL, as in you specify which URL the content should go to from Trello. But with an app, you don't get the ability to create that webhook. There's a property that gives you the URL dynamically, which you have to use in the app, which I'm guessing you could probably do that. You still need a third party app, but yeah, you could do that. We could do that.
Okay.
We could.
Okay.
Yeah.
Lastly, what because now we work on Zoom, everything is recorded, and we work in real time with the client. Like the client can join the calls. Did they join the call, this specific one?
They did. There was one point in time I was having some difficulties with the webhook. It wasn't functioning correctly, and looking at their documentation which they provided and looking at the behavior of the app and the content, it was evident to me that there was something wrong. And I was trying to explain to them, which obviously going to say, no, we're doing the wrong thing. So they had to join a call to see what was happening, and then they realized it was something that they needed to change on their end, which they did. And since then, it was functioning correctly. I think it was something to do with the webhooks and the subscribe function. It wasn't working. It was truncating the URL. So that same dynamic URL that Zapier provides when you create the trigger, it was truncating the end of the URL. So the URL would essentially be wrong. So whenever it's triggered on the app, Zapier would never trigger. And because there's a call to look at all of the webhooks that you have registered. And when you look at the call, the URL for Zapier was shortened. It truncated some of the characters at the end of the URL. So it was essentially the wrong URL it's trying to send the content over to. So Zapier would never trigger. So after I, explained that to them, and then they came on and they saw it, and then they fixed it on again. So I guess it was a character limit for that property on whatever backend that they had their API built on. So we did work together for that.
I love it. Because this gives clients, they having talking on Zoom, having feedback on Zoom is much quicker than imagine doing this over email.
Yeah. My only, and this is the thing, not even well, there that, yes, but what I would really like to sometimes is in the feedback form, if we could take a screenshot of something specifically, because even though there's a recording, a lot of clients don't really look at it. Even though you tell them, listen, look at it at this point, a lot of them don't. They respond to email. Some of them, they do read the feedback summary. So if it could have, I guess I could probably add a link within it and then tell them, yeah, I could do that, yeah. But it would be nice if you could have a screenshot to say, hey, I need this specific thing, or this is what I'm talking about. But a lot of them, they have to see what you're explaining in real time to understand what you mean.
I see. Anything else you'd like to add for this case?
No, I mean, it was a pretty standard experience outside of working together with them. They did come back once to say that it wasn't working. We had a quick 15-minute call only to discover it was something on their end. So we worked with them. We got it published. I think it's out of beta now. It was in beta for the allotted 3 months, and so it's been working ever since. So it was a successful migration from Allflow to Zoomflow.
Is there anything that is there anything that they changed in their APIs?
They did. I think the back end that they were using for the API, I think they were using Amazon S3 in the previous API, and they moved away from that. So the URL endpoint was completely different, and the structure of the responses as well was different in the new version of the API. So it was it was a version change essentially. I actually called it version 2 because nothing from the first version, the URLs and the structure was completely different from the new API which they supplied. So it was a almost like an upgrade of
Yeah, but
the API environment.
cool. But where I want to go as well is like, them having you as a resource and talking to you. You've seen so many APIs so you have all this experience that you can say, okay, okay that you are doing this way, but the traditional or standard way.
Yeah.
So it's easier for you to get on Zapier or any iPaaS or being integrated. And these are the best practices. So having that conversation with you help them, develop their product in the best way possible.
Yeah. And I did have the workaround I had to use for them was the friendly name bit.
It was super helpful.
Okay. All right then. Yeah.
Have a good day. Bye, Yukana.
Bye.